The human fleet didn't attack our people. They did not bring the fire of 1,000 suns to turn our cities into glass. And they did not darken our skies with the monolithic ships of an invading empire. The humans simply arrived on a Tuesday, deployed a cloud of shimmering, sub-microscopic gnats to blind our senses, and began the most surgical deconstruction of a superpower in the history of the stars. I watched from the command deck of the Star Sovereign as the chaos began. We were the dominant force in this sector. We had spent decades refining our orbital bombardment cannons, our shield generators, and our kinetic interceptors. We were a civilization forged in the furnace of war. And yet, in the span of an hour, the humans reduced our pride to a collection of inert metal parts. The gnats were the first sign of the change. They were not weapons of war in the traditional sense. They were swarms of nanotechnological devices that latched onto our weapons systems, our communication arrays, and our navigation computers. They did not explode. They did not burn. They simply entered the architecture of our fleet and began to unmake the connections. I remember standing at the master console, watching the data streams go blank. I ordered a full system reboot. Nothing. I ordered a manual override. The manual overrides had been physically disconnected from the central power core. The humans had not destroyed our systems. They had systematically dismantled the logic that made them function. It was an act of organized intention. By the second hour, the fleet was drifting. We were not dead, but we were paralyzed. The humans moved among our ships in small, nimble vessels that looked more like industrial repair units than combat platforms. They were not there to fight. They were there to salvage. They moved from one capital ship to the next, boarding with precision, ignoring the crew entirely. They were interested in one thing only. They wanted the gears. They wanted our high-efficiency plasma manifolds, our graviton-stabilized cooling loops, and our specialized power coupling nodes. They stripped our ships of the essential components that made our military power possible. They did not touch the life support, and they did not harm the civilians on the surface. They simply removed the capacity for us to ever threaten them again. I stood on the bridge of the Sovereign as a human boarding party walked past our paralyzed security guards. The humans didn't look at them. They didn't threaten them. They looked at the heavy-duty reactor shunt behind the command chair and began to unbolt it with the casual efficiency of a technician performing routine maintenance. I shouted at their leader, demanding to know what right they had to strip our technology. The human didn't look up. He just tightened his grip on his impact wrench, backed out the last bolt, and sighed. He told me they weren't interested in a war because war was bad for efficiency. He said that a burning planet was a waste of resources, and a dead population was a missed opportunity for future trade. He told me they had been watching our progress for years, and they had decided we were a nuisance that needed to be downgraded. He didn't hate us. Hate implies a sense of equality. He treated us like an overgrown tree that needed its branches trimmed back so it wouldn't block the light. When they finished, the human leader gave a single, curt nod. His team retreated to their transports, leaving our fleet a skeleton of its former glory. They didn't take our fuel, they didn't steal our gold, and they didn't occupy our world. They just took the vital organs of our military and left. The silence that followed their departure was more deafening than any war. We were left in our ships, floating in the dark, surrounded by the hulks of our own greatness. We were still alive, but we were no longer a threat. We were no longer an empire. We were just a people who had been taught a very hard lesson about the difference between power and utility. The humans had shown us that the true mark of superiority is not the ability to destroy, but the ability to neutralize. It is the ability to walk into the home of an enemy, disassemble their defenses while they watch, and leave them with nothing but the truth of their own insignificance. This is a lesson for anyone who believes that conflict is the only path to dominance. If you spend your life building walls and sharpening blades, you are only preparing yourself to be dismantled. The world does not fear the loud, the world fears the efficient. The world fears the one who knows exactly where your gears are and how to take them home with them. Stop focusing on the size of your weapons. Stop focusing on the scale of your destruction. Start focusing on the integrity of your foundations. If your survival depends on components that can be stolen, your survival is already in the hands of someone else. Take a look at your life today. Look at the systems you rely on. Look at the tools you use to project your power. Ask yourself if you are building something that can be dismantled, or something that is essential to the reality of those around you. Do not be a target. Be a partner. Build something that no one wants to take away. Because the humans did not leave because they were finished. They left because they had made their point. And if you continue to act like a nuisance, they will be back. Start building for the future. Stop building for the fight. And remember that the most dangerous enemy is the one who does not bother to kill you. The one who leaves you standing but takes all of your gears. Take a deep breath. Tighten your own bolts. And make sure you are not built to be salvaged. The return to our home world was not a triumphant procession, but a silent, dragging retreat through the graveyard of our own ambition. Our ships, now hollowed-out shells of carbon fiber and alloy, drifted back into the atmosphere like dead leaves falling in autumn. We were a civilization grounded. We were a navy without a pulse, and yet the planet below was untouched. No firestorms, no orbital craters, no weeping, broken populace. The humans had left us with our homes, our families, and our cities, but they had taken the very heart of our sovereignty. I spent the weeks that followed in the deep, subterranean archives of the military complex. I had access to every log, every diagnostic report, and every security recording from the day of the arrival. I needed to understand the mechanics of our humiliation. I needed to see exactly how they had bypassed our early warning systems, our quantum-encrypted barriers, and our kinetic shields as if they were nothing more than paper screens in a summer breeze. The truth was buried in the data, in the sublayers of the network logs that the humans hadn't even bothered to delete. They had been here for decades. They hadn't come for a conquest, they had come for a census. They had placed sensors in our power grids, listening devices in our command nodes, and microscopic, inert relays in the hulls of our primary warships while they were still being manufactured in the orbital shipyards. They hadn't needed to hack our systems on the day of the arrival. They had simply logged into a network they had effectively been co-managing since our infancy. I looked at a holographic projection of one of the gnats. It was a marvel of engineering, a swarm intelligence drone no larger than a grain of sand, equipped with a localized dampener that could sync perfectly with the vibrational frequency of our circuitry. It didn't fight the current. It harmonized with it until the current ceased to be useful. They weren't invaders. They were engineers performing a system-wide patch on an unruly subsystem. I left the archives and went to the surface. The capital city was quiet. The people didn't know what had happened in the void. They only knew that the sky was no longer filled with the patrols of our fleet. They were living their lives, unaware that their entire military paradigm had been evaporated by a species that viewed their weapons systems as a design flaw. I met with the Planetary Council in the Great Rotunda, a chamber of marble and gold that had been the seat of our pride for centuries. They were desperate, arguing for a massive, state-funded rebuilding project. They wanted to pour every credit, every resource, and every ounce of our remaining labor into the development of new shielding, new cannons, and new dreadnoughts. They wanted to prove that we were still a power to be reckoned with. I stood at the podium, my uniform stained with the oil and dust of the maintenance decks, and I told them the truth. I told them that we were not a power, we were a resource buffer. I told them that if they rebuilt, the humans would simply return, not to destroy us, but to salvage the new parts. There was a heavy, suffocating silence in the room. They didn't want to hear that our era of dominance was over. They didn't want to hear that we were no longer the masters of our own destiny. But the reality of our situation was staring us in the face. We had built an empire on the back of brute force. We had spent all of our resources on the art of being a threat. We had neglected the art of being a society. We had forgotten that when you center your entire existence on the ability to inflict violence, you inevitably become a problem that a more efficient entity will eventually solve. The humans weren't the villains of our story. We were the villains of theirs. We were the obstacle in the path of their growth, and they had the clarity of mind to recognize that we didn't need to be destroyed to be cleared. We just needed to be neutralized. I retired from the service that day. I left my medals on the dais of the council chamber and walked out into the warm, golden light of the afternoon sun. I went to the residential district, found a small workshop on the edge of the city, and began to work with my hands. I fixed broken heaters, I calibrated water filtration systems, and I helped the locals repair their agricultural drones. I found, for the first time in my life, that there was a deeper kind of power in the act of building than there ever was in the act of destruction. The galaxy is vast and uncaring. It is filled with powers that will rise and fall and empires that will burn in the heat of their own hubris. But the ones who endure, the ones who don't get salvaged, are the ones who know how to build a life that is truly theirs. They are the ones who don't need gears of war to justify their existence. They are the ones who make themselves essential to the reality of the universe. If you are currently worried about the threats looming on your horizon, stop. Stop preparing for the fight that you think is inevitable. Stop building your life around the weapons you hold. Start building a life that is so deeply integrated, so profoundly useful, and so undeniably constructive that your presence is a benefit to everyone who knows you. Do not be the gear that the humans come to steal. Be the foundation that they choose not to touch. The humans are still out there, watching, waiting, and evaluating. They are looking for the next problem to solve, the next system to patch, and the next empire to trim back. Make sure that when they look at you, they don't see a nuisance. Make sure they see a partner. Take a deep breath. Put down your weapons and start building something that lasts. Because the world doesn't belong to the ones who fight. The world belongs to the ones who build. Your work is waiting. Get to it. The workshop became my sanctuary, but it was also a place of quiet, gnawing observation. I spent my days beneath the chassis of solar skimmers and atmospheric processors, my hands permanently stained with the grease of a dozen different machines. People would come to me with their broken lives, their malfunctioning power cells, their frozen cooling loops, their erratic data relays, and I would repair them with a sense of clarity I had never known in the sterile, high-pressure environment of the flagship. Yet, I was not alone in my work. I began to notice the subtle anomalies. It started with the delivery drones that brought my spare parts. They were standard, mass-produced units, but their navigation subroutines were suspiciously efficient. They didn't take the long, winding paths through the city streets. They moved with an angular, almost geometric precision that suggested they were running on a localized, high-level optimization algorithm. I would occasionally find microchips embedded in the base of the components I ordered, chips that were not part of our native technology. They were human, of course, not as part of a military intrusion, but as a silent, ongoing administrative maintenance. I realized then that the humans hadn't just left. They had effectively become the silent architects of our recovery. They were ensuring that our society didn't collapse, that our power grids remained stable, and that our basic utilities continued to function at an optimal level. They weren't just checking the gears they had taken, they were monitoring the system that remained. It was a form of control far more insidious, and, in its own way, far more benevolent than any occupation. One evening, a young man came to my shop carrying a damaged navigation unit from a cargo transport. He was terrified, whispering about how the local network had fixed itself whenever he encountered a bottleneck in the cargo routing. He asked me if I thought we were being haunted by ghosts in the machine. I looked at the unit. It was humming with a perfect 60 Hz resonance that was not the product of our local grid. I touched the surface of the casing, and I could feel the microscopic vibrations of the gnats, the same invisible presence that had blinded our fleet. They were everywhere. They were embedded in the walls of our homes, the fibers of our clothing, and the very air of our cities. They were not occupying us. They were keeping us in a state of perfectly regulated functionality. We were the planet-sized equivalent of a well-maintained tool. I didn't tell him the truth. I just smiled, took the unit from him, and told him that the machine was just running better because we were finally starting to understand how to treat it with respect. He left, satisfied, and I went back to my bench, but I couldn't ignore the weight of the realization. We had lost our sovereignty, but we had gained a stability we never could have engineered on our own. This is the hidden cost of progress. There is a point where the systems you build to protect yourself become so complex, so interconnected, and so vital that they inevitably fall under the management of those who understand them better than you do. You can fight to maintain your independence, you can build your walls and sharpen your blades, but eventually, you will be measured by your efficiency. If you are a malfunctioning system, you will be dismantled. If you are an efficient, stable, and essential part of the larger machine, you will be maintained. The choice, ultimately, is not whether you will be free. The choice is what role you will play in the larger architecture of the galaxy. I looked up at the stars through the skylight of my workshop. I could see the faint, rhythmic blinking of the orbital satellites, human-designed, human-maintained, and human-optimized. They weren't looking down at us with malice. They were looking at us with the detached, analytical focus of a gardener looking at a flowerbed. They weren't waiting for us to rise up again. They were waiting for us to grow into the role they had designed for us. I picked up my wrench. There was a rusted valve on the central water processor that needed to be replaced. It was a small task, a trivial piece of work in the grand scheme of an empire, but it was mine. It was a piece of the world that I could still control and that I could still make better. If you are currently living in a world that feels as though it is shifting beneath your feet, stop trying to fight the shift. Stop trying to reclaim the version of the past that allowed you to believe you were the masters of everything. Look at the systems you occupy. Understand your place within them. And find the small, critical pieces of your life that you can still make efficient, stable, and truly your own. Do not be the part of the system that causes the error. Be the part of the system that functions so well that the architecture depends on you. The humans aren't going to return with their fleets. They don't need to. They are already here. Don't forget to like, in the light, comment, and in the silence of the network. For more incredible stories. Don't be afraid. Hit the bell icon to stay updated on our latest uploads. Be reliable. And build something that is worth keeping. The night was quiet. The city was calm, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for the war to start again. I was just waiting for the morning and the work that it would bring. Take a deep breath. The gears are turning. Make sure yours are greased. And get to work. Please continue. The seasons began to blur, marking the passage of years rather than mere cycles. In my workshop, I stopped keeping track of the orbital calendar and started measuring time by the slow, steady improvement of our city's infrastructure. The humans remained invisible, an omnipresent hand that nudged the world toward a horizon of perfect, predictable stability. We were no longer a civilization that reached for the stars in a frantic, desperate grasp for power. We were a civilization that looked at its own reflection and finally understood what it was: a project. A project that, for the first time, was starting to show signs of maturity. I remember the day the first freighter from the neighboring system docked at our primary hub. It was not a military vessel, nor was it a sleek, terrifying human ship. It was a trade freighter, its hull painted with the colors of a dozen different planetary guilds. It carried food, medicine, and technologies that we had previously been denied. For decades, we had been an isolated, martial bastion, but as the humans continued their quiet administration of our grid, the trade barriers that our own paranoia had erected began to erode. I stood on the observation deck of the spaceport, watching the cargo being unloaded. I saw the people of our world mingling with travelers from across the sector. There was no fear in their eyes. There was no desperate, clutching need for defense. They were simply people, living in a world that finally had the capacity to support their ambitions, rather than forcing them to sacrifice everything for the preservation of a failing military dream. I felt a strange, lingering sense of loss, but beneath it was a profound, grounding relief. We had lost our role as the predators, but we had gained our humanity. The humans hadn't taken our gears to leave us broken. They had taken the gears that allowed us to be dangerous, and in their place, they had installed the gears that allowed us to be connected. I returned to my workshop to find an unexpected guest waiting for me. He was a human. Or, at least, he looked like one. He wore simple, grey work clothes and carried no weapon, only a small, leather-bound manual. He sat at my workbench, looking at the half-disassembled water pump with an intensity that made me realize he wasn't just a visitor. He was an evaluator. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't speak of the fleet or the occupation or the fall of our empire. He simply pointed to the valve I had replaced the night before. "That is a remarkably clean connection," he said. "Most of the technicians in this sector use a standard bypass, but you opted for a custom gasket. It adds 3% more flow efficiency to the overall system." I felt a flash of my old, martial pride, but I suppressed it. It wasn't about pride anymore. It was about the work. "I learned the trade from the archives," I replied, my voice steady. "I realized that if the system is to remain stable, the parts must be held to a higher standard." The human nodded, a small, knowing smile touching his lips. "Exactly. That is the point of the maintenance. It is not about keeping things down, it is about ensuring that the parts are capable of sustaining the load." He stood up, placed the manual on the bench, and walked toward the door. I asked him, before he left, if they would ever leave us entirely. If there would come a day when we could manage our own grid, our own trade, and our own destiny without their invisible, omnipresent hand guiding the flow. He stopped in the doorway and looked back at the city, the sprawling, functioning metropolis that was finally at peace. "We don't leave," he said simply. "We simply stop needing to provide the maintenance as you start to provide it yourselves. You are becoming the system, rather than just a component within it." He stepped out into the street and vanished into the crowd of bustling merchants and commuters, a ghost in a machine he had helped to build. I looked down at the manual he had left behind. It wasn't a manual for war. It was a guide for planetary energy management, a document so complex and so elegantly written that it made our finest military manuals look like the scribblings of children. I realized then that we had been fighting the wrong battle. We thought the struggle was about who held the power. We thought it was about who had the bigger fleet, the thicker armor, or the sharper edge. But we were wrong. The struggle was about competence. It was about the ability to understand the environment you lived in, to manage the resources you had, and to build a reality that was worth living in. The humans weren't our enemies because they defeated us. They were our teachers because they forced us to see that our own arrogance had been our greatest weakness. I am an old man now, and the workshop is no longer just my own. I have apprentices, young people who have never known the sound of an orbital bombardment, who have never feared the sight of a human starship, and who look at the machines of our world not as weapons of power, but as tools for life. We are not an empire. We are not a superpower. We are something much more important. We are a functioning piece of a larger galactic order. We are reliable. We are efficient. And we are, for the first time, at peace with our own limitations. If you find yourself struggling with the weight of your own ambition, or if you find yourself feeling diminished by the success of those around you, stop. Stop trying to measure your worth by the damage you can cause. Stop trying to build your life around the things you can break. Look for the roles you can fulfill. Look for the responsibilities you can manage. Find the part of your reality that you can make more efficient, more stable, and more useful to the people around you. Because the world will eventually belong to the ones who build it, one connection at a time. The humans aren't coming to destroy you. They are coming to see if you are ready to build. Make them see that you are. Take a deep breath. Put your hands on the work. And never stop turning the gears. The future isn't something that happens to you. It is something you have to build. Do it right. And do it to last. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more incredible stories. Hit the bell icon to stay updated on our latest uploads.